I used to have a friend who was barely scraping by. I knew for a fact he was skipping meals during the last week of the month just to make rent. Yet, whenever we went to a party, he would walk in clutching a bottle of single malt scotch that cost more than my car payment.
Wow.
I remember watching him one night. He placed that bottle on the center of the table with a strange ceremonial weight, insisting on pouring a glass for everyone. His face wasn't anxious about the money he'd just lost. It was glowing with this intense, almost giddy satisfaction. He looked like a king for that hour, even though I knew his fridge at home was completely empty.
That is a powerful image.
From the outside, it looked like pure self-destructive vanity. It felt like watching a car crash in slow motion, a terrible financial decision born out of insecurity. You wanted to shake him and ask why he was literally starving himself just to impress a room full of people who didn't care. But here is where it gets interesting. What if I told you that his behavior wasn't a mistake? What if that empty fridge and that luxury bottle aren't contradictions, but actually the result of a precise biological calculation? It turns out my friend wasn't being stupid. He was unknowingly executing a survival strategy that is hundreds of thousands of years old, the same logic that forces a specific bird to grow a tail so heavy it almost gets him killed.
That story, it just perfectly captures the central puzzle, doesn't it? This seemingly irrational human impulse we have toward things that are extravagant, inefficient.
Sometimes completely self-destructive.
Exactly. And this entire phenomenon, from your friend's scotch all the way up to, say, massive corporate philanthropy, it can all be explained by one single evolutionary framework. And that is costly signaling theory, or CST.
Okay, so let's unpack this. CST is going to be our lens for this whole deep dive. We're looking at a huge range of material today. Everything from evolutionary psychology and consumer studies, all the way to ethnographic field research from these tiny villages around the world.
Right.
And our mission really is to show you exactly how this ancient biological logic is still dictating so much of our modern lives. It governs everything from who we date to, who we decide to trust in business.
At its most basic level, costly signaling theory. It posits that certain traits or behaviors evolve for a very specific reason.
Okay.
That reason is to reliably advertise an individual's underlying quality, something you can't see.
So things like genetic fitness, wealth, maybe how committed someone is.
Yeah.
Stuff you can't just know by looking at them.
Precisely. And the key part, the part that makes the whole thing work, is that the signal has to be honest.
And to make it honest, there has to be some kind of barrier to entry. It has to cost something, right? Enough that someone who doesn't have that quality can't afford to fake it without, suffering some serious consequences.
That is the absolute core of it. This mechanism, the one that enforces honesty by imposing a cost that deters fakers, that's what became famously known as the Handicap Principle.
It sounds so backward, though. The fact that you can afford to pay this high price is the proof.
It is the proof. The wastefulness, the handicap, is the message itself.
So if my friend had just, put colored water in that scotch bottle and tried to pass it off, that would have been a cheap, dishonest signal.
Totally.
But because he paid the genuine, painful price for the real bottle, the signal was reliable, even though it was, bankrupting him.
That reliability is what matters for evolutionary stability. In biology and social science, we have to make a really careful distinction between a cue and a signal.
Okay, what's the difference there?
A cue is just unintentional information. If you see me yawning, my eyes are tired, that's a cue that I probably need more sleep.
Right. You didn't evolve to yawn specifically to tell me you're tired. It just happens.
Exactly. Just gives away information. But a signal is totally different. A signal evolved specifically to communicate something.
To influence someone else?
To influence the behavior or the perception of the receiver, yes. Think of the bright flashing colors on a poison dart frog, or the incredibly intricate nest that a bowerbird builds. Those are signals.
And because they exist to communicate, they could be faked.
They're inherently vulnerable to manipulation. If a frog could look poisonous without actually being poisonous, or if a lazy bird could slap together a flimsy nest that just looked impressive, that would be cheating the system.
And natural selection would favor anyone who could see through the fake? The bird that picks the better nest, the predator that avoids the actually poisonous frog?
Right. So the system has to evolve a resistance to cheaters. And the only way to maintain that honesty, especially when the sender and receiver have a conflict of interest, is through cost.
The cost has to be so high that a low-quality individual just can't do it.
They can't do it consistently without it backfiring. That's what keeps the signal reliable.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around the mechanism of cost, though. If I'm poor and I spend my last dollar on a Rolex, I've paid the absolute cost.
But you're saying it's more about a differential cost. Can you break that down? Yeah, that's a crucial distinction. It's about the differential marginal cost. The system works because producing the signal has to be comparatively cheaper for someone who genuinely has the high quality than for someone who doesn't.
Okay. An example would help.
Let's stick with animals for a second. Imagine an animal's health. A really high-quality animal has great genes, a strong immune system, lots of energy. For that animal to produce a flashy signal, say growing its antlers just a little bit bigger, the energy cost it's trivial, it's easily absorbed.
It's an inconvenience, maybe, but it's not a threat to its survival.
Correct. But now take a weak, maybe a sick or malnourished animal. For that animal to try and produce the exact same size antler, it has to divert resources from critical systems.
Like from its immune function or just basic metabolism.
Exactly. So that relative cost, what we call the differential marginal cost of just increasing the signal by one little unit, is exponentially higher for the low-quality individual. They simply can't afford that marginal increase in spending without seriously hurting their own health or survival.
And that huge difference in the price tag is what stops the cheating.
That's the enforcer. The investment in the signal is optimized differently depending on your condition, and that difference is what natural selection acts on.
Okay, this idea that costly investment equals honesty, it really forces us to go back to the original biological puzzle that started it all. The peacock's tail.
It's the classic example, yeah.
Because its extravagance just baffled people for centuries.
It baffled Darwin. He openly admitted that traits like the peacock's tail were a major challenge to his theory of natural selection.
Because they look like a terrible idea from a survival perspective.
Terrible idea. They're huge, they're cumbersome, they're brightly colored so they attract predators, they make it harder to escape, they genuinely look like a survival handicap, and yet...
The peons love them.
The peons love them. So it clearly enhances reproductive success, which proved the power of what he called sexual selection.
And this whole puzzle led to this really radical proposal from Ahmad Zahavi back in 1975, the Handicap Principle.
Zahavi's idea it was really out there at the time. He basically proposed that the signal's value is its wastefulness, that these costly signals evolve because they reduce survival potential.
So the logic is, I'm so strong, so healthy, I can afford to strap this giant useless thing to my back and still outrun a tiger.
Precisely. To survive, despite having this obvious disadvantage, was the reliable proof of superior genes, superior health, superior everything. The signal had to be an overinvestment, costlier than it needed to be just to prove you were tough enough to take the hit.
Which sounds completely counter-Darwinian. I mean, evolution is supposed to favor efficiency, right?
It is, and that's why many evolutionary biologists at the time just dismissed the idea. It seemed mathematically unstable. It violated that core concept of getting the maximum fitness return for the minimum energy cost. Zahavi was proposing something that felt almost anti-evolutionary.
So his core idea had flaws, but the name, the Handicap Principle, that really stuck in the public mind.
It did.
We need to be super clear for you listening. What is the actual difference between Zahavi's original kind of flawed idea and the modern theory that's widely supported today?
The modern supported theory is usually called condition-dependent signaling, or sometimes strategic choice signaling. A lot of this comes from the really rigorous mathematical models that Alan Graffin developed in 1990.
Okay.
And the difference is subtle, but it's absolutely crucial. In the modern view, the signal is not purposefully wasteful. Selection does not favor waste for waste's sake.
Okay, so if it's not wasteful, what is it?
It's an optimal investment. Selection favors the individual who invests just enough in the signal to maximize the reproductive benefits while minimizing the fitness costs for their specific condition.
So they're adjusting the signal based on how healthy they actually are.
Adaptively, yes. The size of the tail, the brightness of the colors, how long they spend displaying, it's all adjusted based on their true underlying quality. The tail isn't costlier than it needs to be. It's exactly as costly as that particular peacock can afford to maintain efficiently.
So the health of the animal directly determines the splendor of the signal. It's not some arbitrary bar of waste this much to prove you're worthy.
Right. And that brings us right back to the differential marginal cost. That's the true enforcer.
Let's use that modern analogy again, the gym membership.
Perfect. So you've got two people. One's an heir with a huge trust fund. The other is a struggling student. They both want to signal financial health by having a fancy gym membership that costs, say, $300 a month.
The absolute cost is the same for both, $300.
Yes, but the marginal cost is wildly different. For the air, that $300 is nothing. It's a rounding error. They can easily produce that signal, and the social benefit they get outweighs that tiny cost.
But for the student?
For the struggling student, maintaining that $300 membership, that marginal cost, means they're actively sacrificing necessities, maybe their food budget or transportation. It severely compromises their long-term well-being.
So the high-quality individual, the heir, finds it much easier to pay for the next month's membership than the low-quality individual does. The risk of failure for the student is what deters them from keeping up the lie long-term.
And that is condition-dependent signaling in action. The peacock doesn't grow the tail to be wasteful. He grows the biggest, brightest tail he can efficiently maintain. And that size and health instantly broadcasts his quality, because only the very healthiest can absorb the marginal cost of maintaining that thing year after year without dying.
Which brings us squarely to us, to humanity. We take that same peacock logic and we apply it to social signaling, which leads directly to this phenomenon of conspicuous consumption. The Porsches and, yes, the expensive Scotch bottles.
The term itself is fascinating. It was coined by the economist Thorstein Veblen way back in 1899 in his masterpiece, The Theory of the Leisure Class.
And he was noticing that certain people, especially the newly wealthy, were engaging in these extravagant displays of luxury that served no real practical purpose.
None at all. It was all about displaying status.
So the definition is basically acquiring and displaying expensive luxury items that give you little to no extra functional value over cheaper versions. Like buying a bespoke suit for thousands of dollars when an off-the-rack one keeps you just as warm.
Or a watch that tells time no better than one that costs $50. The utility is secondary, the social status from the cost is primary.
And this isn't just a modern capitalist thing, right? The source material makes it clear this is universal.
It's everywhere, and throughout history. You see it in the immense resource-intensive architecture of Incan palaces, the golden thrones in ancient Egypt. Even in some isolated foraging tribes, you see people flaunting expensive possessions.
That historical universality that really points to a deep, ancient evolutionary function. So let's dive into the research that connects this kind of consumption directly to our mating strategies.
This is where it gets really, really interesting. Because what researchers have found is that conspicuous consumption isn't usually a general display of "I have money." It's often a very precise signal tied to sexual strategy.
And primarily male sexual strategy.
Primarily male. And the signal isn't about broadcasting, "I'd be a great stable provider."
No.
No. The key discovery is that the motivation to conspicuously consume is specifically enhanced among men who are pursuing what's called a sexually unrestricted, low-investment mating strategy.
So men who are looking for short-term flings, casual relationships, not a committed partner.
Exactly. The behavior is triggered by a short-term mating motivation, but, and this is the critical part, not by a long-term one.
Hold on, that feels like it completely flips the common wisdom on its head. The idea that men buy a fancy car to attract a wife, you're saying it's actually a signal that's most effective when the goal is a fling.
That is what the data overwhelmingly suggests. In fact, if a man is primed with a desire for a committed, high-investment relationship, someone to build a future with, his desire to buy frivolous luxury goods actually goes down.
Why? Why does that distinction exist? And what is it about that wastefulness that's appealing to a short-term mate?
It works because that conspicuous waste spending a lot of money on things that depreciate instantly or have no real utility, it signals a lack of inclination to save or invest or manage resources for the long term.
So it signals irresponsibility.
Which is a massive red flag for anyone looking for a long-term partner, right? You want stability.
But for a short-term mate?
For a short-term mate, the Porsche, or the expensive Scotch, signals immediate access to resources. It signals high social status, maybe even good genes. The ability to just burn resources today because you're so successful or so genetically fit you don't have to worry about tomorrow.
So it's an honest signal of present value,
yeah,
but also an honest signal of future unreliability.
Exactly. And you can see how modern luxury brands, maybe without even knowing the evolutionary science, are perfectly built to exploit this.
They're tapping right into this male wiring.
Absolutely. The entire luxury market is structurally designed to leverage this ancient impulse. They prioritize huge, visible logos, highly recognizable status markers. The perceived cost, the exclusivity is the product, not the functional quality of the item.
And the specific psychological mechanism being exploited is this desire for external display, which was shown so clearly in that knockoff wallet experiment.
That experiment is brilliant because it perfectly separates internal self-esteem from the external signaling motive.
So walk us through. What did they do?
They took men who were pursuing that low-investment mating strategy and they primed them for mating. Then they gave them a choice: buy a regular non-brand wallet or buy a designer replica, a knockoff, for the same price.
Okay, so the knockoff looks high status on the outside, but the buyer knows it's cheap on the inside.
Exactly. So bumping the knockoff means you're sacrificing genuine quality for the sake of external appearance. If your motivation was, say, self-esteem or a love of fine craftsmanship, you'd avoid the fake.
But that's not what happened.
Not at all. The low-investment men, when primed for mating, had significantly higher intentions to purchase the conspicuous knockoff wallet. It confirms the behavior is fundamentally driven by the desire for external display to others. It's about signaling status to a potential mate, not about how you feel about the product yourself.
The signaling function just overrides any other rational purchasing decision. The signal just has to look costly enough to be believable.
Precisely. And the receivers of the signal women are remarkably good at reading it.
They decode the message accurately.
Incredibly accurately. In follow-up studies, women evaluated men who had just bought either a non-conspicuous car, like a Honda Civic, or a highly conspicuous one, a Porsche Boxster.
And what was the finding?
The women perceived the man driving the expensive Porsche as more desirable for a short-term relationship, like a date, but
less desirable for a long-term one.
Significantly less desirable for a long-term relationship, like marriage or as a potential father. The women accurately interpreted that costly, wasteful signal. They saw it as a display of immediate resources, but also as a sign of low commitment and future unreliability.
The Porsche is basically a billboard that says, high-quality genes, low parenting investment.
It's a brutal but incredibly efficient piece of biological information exchange. It shows that our consumption choices are not random. They are a highly specialized mating display, and women's mate choice strategies are tuned to accurately decipher what that wastefulness really means.
Okay, we should touch on the other side of this. If men are using conspicuous consumption for short-term mating, what about women? Do women use luxury items as a costly signal in the same way?
That's a great question, and the data there is much, much more mixed. It's really inconsistent in mating contexts.
So it's not the same pattern?
No. While the link for men to low-investment mating is very clear, women's luxury spending doesn't seem to follow that script. The prevailing hypothesis is that when women do engage in high-cost consumption, the motivation is often intersexual competition.
Meaning they're signaling to other women, not to men?
Primarily to rival women, yes. Signaling things like high status or resource access, maybe indicating the quality or the commitment level of their existing partner, rather than trying to directly attract a new short-term mate.
Okay, so while sexual selection is a huge piece of this, explaining romance and Porsches, costly signaling theory goes way beyond that. It's fundamental to how we navigate our entire social lives.
Yes, now we shift from signaling genetic fitness to signaling social capital.
So traits like being trustworthy, skilled, generous, your overall value as a cooperative partner.
And the underlying logic is identical, right? If I want to prove to you that I'm reliable, the only way to do it is to make an investment that would be too costly for someone who plans to cheat me later.
It's a screening mechanism.
Exactly. For cooperation to evolve, we needed reliable ways to filter out the free riders and the cheaters. Costly signals provide that filter. A great example of this is the show-off hypothesis, which you can see in resource sharing in many small-scale societies.
This is where we see hunters targeting really big, difficult game, like turtles for the Miriam people, or big game animals for the Hadza and Ache.
And from a purely caloric efficiency standpoint, these hunts often don't make sense. A hunter might spend days risking his life to bring back this massive animal,
only to have the meat shared widely across the entire group. He doesn't even get to keep most of it for his own family.
Right. So you have to ask, why do it? Why take the massive risk for such an inefficient return? Why not just hunt smaller, more reliable prey that you can keep for yourself?
Because the hunt itself is the signal.
The act of acquiring that difficult prey is the costly signal. It demonstrates, without any room for doubt, all these unobservable qualities: superior strength, incredible skill, endurance, leadership potential.
And sharing the meat publicly just amplifies that signal. They make sure everyone sees it.
It dramatically increases the reach of the signal.
But wait, if the whole point is just getting a reputation, why not just lie? Why not fake a kill or just, exaggerate how hard the hunt was? It seems a lot easier to cheat than to actually risk your life.
And that's the core problem that CST solves. Big game hunting is just inherently difficult to fake. You can't secretly catch a giant sea turtle. You can't pretend you took down an eland. The act is public, the risk is real, and the evidence, the meat, is right there for everyone to inspect.
The cost and the public nature of it make the signal reliable.
And by demonstrating that skill and then that generosity, the hunter boosts their reputation. This makes them far more likely to be chosen as a preferred cooperative partner in the future, as an ally, as a campmate. The investment pays off in long-term social capital, which is worth far more than the short-term loss of calories.
And you can see how that model translates so smoothly into modern life. Things like public philanthropy.
Absolutely. A huge, extravagant charitable donation is a costly signal of wealth and resource control. Only someone with immense resources can afford to give away millions of dollars publicly, and that signal is primarily aimed at attracting new cooperators.
People outside their immediate circle.
Right, new business partners, new political allies, people who wouldn't otherwise know about their capacity.
But I remember the material mentioning a kind of reputation trade-off here. It's not always a good look to be too flashy with your giving, is it?
No, and this is a really fascinating nuance. If these public displays of generosity look like they're purely for self-promotion, if they seem too conspicuous, they can actually decrease the signaler's perceived trustworthiness among their existing partners.
So your close friends or your current business partners might see it differently.
They might see that flashy public donation as you trying to court new allies at the expense of investing in the relationships you already have. They might prefer quieter, more consistent signals of your cooperative intent over some big public display.
So the audience completely changes how the signal is received. If you want new partners, go public. If you're trying to reassure your current team, maybe do something more private and direct.
Precisely. And for a pure, almost perfect example of an altruistic signal, you can look at blood donation.
Because there's a real cost, but you have no control over who gets the benefit.
Exactly. There's the cost of your time, the inconvenience, the slight physical risk, and it confirms you're healthy enough to donate. But crucially, you have zero say in who receives your blood. It's a costly investment with absolutely no individual financial return.
So it's just a pure signal of pro-sociality.
A very reliable signal of generosity and commitment to the group, which are highly valued qualities in any potential partner.
Okay, let's narrow the focus one more time here to our most specific relationships, like a deep friendship or a romance, where costly signals are all about establishing commitment.
This is the domain of gift giving. Gifts are so essential for starting and maintaining valuable relationships because, especially at the beginning, you don't know the other person's true intentions. There's a huge risk of defection.
And a costly gift makes that defection less likely.
Yes, because the financial cost, or even just the time and effort required to find a truly thoughtful gift, simply wouldn't be worth it for someone who plans to leave early or who doesn't genuinely value the future of the relationship. The cost proves the sincerity of the intention.
And the type of gift matters too, evolutionarily speaking.
It does. Research suggests that gifts that are highly personalized, or maybe sex-specific, or things that degrade quickly, they're favored.
Like flowers or a really nice meal.
Exactly. Because those things reduce the risk of manipulation. If I give you a generic, durable gift, like a piece of jewelry, you could potentially benefit by just re-gifting it or selling it after you end our relationship.
But you can't re-gift a dinner or a bouquet of flowers a week later.
Right. Gifts that are hard to monetize or pass on signal that the recipient is valued specifically, which minimizes the risk for the person giving the gift.
We've established this principle that the signal has to be costly. But the actual form of that cost has to be massively influenced by the local culture, right? The economic context. A costly signal in, say, Manhattan might be totally meaningless in a remote village, and vice versa.
The local environment acts as a filter. It dictates not only what form the signal takes, but whether the quality being signaled is even desirable in the first place. This is where looking at cross-cultural male signaling gets really illuminating. The underlying logic is universal, but the output is so variable.
We see this perfectly in that Japanese study that contrasted risk-taking and leadership. In most Western cultures, status is tied pretty closely to dominance, to competitive risk-taking.
But in many Eastern societies, like Japan, group harmony is often a much higher social value. So this study looked at how Japanese adults evaluated risk-taking in two completely different contexts, a competitive one and a cooperative one.
Okay, so in the competitive context, say, my group against your group, the costly signal of being a risk taker should pay off.
And it did. When the Japanese adults were evaluating risk-taking in a situation where the group was competing against an outside party, it strongly increased the perception of dominance. And that perceived dominance, in turn, led to a much higher endorsement for leadership. Risk-taking was seen as a valuable trait when you needed to beat an opponent.
But what happened when the goal was internal cooperation? When everyone was on the same team, trying to get along?
This is where the cultural filter is so clear. The costly signal itself was still read correctly. The risk-taking still led to a high perception of dominance. The message was received.
But the value of that message changed.
It changed dramatically. In the cooperative scenario, dominance was negatively associated with being endorsed for leadership. The overall effect of risk-taking on leadership became much weaker, even slightly negative.
So the signal, I am dominant and powerful, was successfully broadcast. But the community's response was, that's great, but we don't want a dominant leader right now. We want a harmonious one. The cultural goal rejected the signal's value.
Exactly. The ultimate reward for the signal depends on the cultural marketplace. A signal is only adaptive if the quality it's advertising is actually desirable in that specific context.
We see an even more intricate split based on culture and gender when we look at religious practices, which might be one of the most common forms of costly signaling we see across human societies.
Let's talk about that study from the rural Tibetan village.
Right.
Religious behaviors, meditation, fasting, going on pilgrimages are incredibly costly. They take up huge amounts of time, energy, and money. So they function as very reliable signals of commitment to the community, of trustworthiness.
But in this specific patriarchal society, men and women had to signal in completely different ways, based entirely on who controlled the family's money.
Right. Since the men controlled the financial wealth, their signaling strategy was built around that.
What did that look like?
For men, the primary costly signal was undertaking distant pilgrimages. These are rare events, but they involve enormous financial costs, long travel times, and being away from the village for a while.
A big, spectacular financial signal.
Yeah?
And was it effective?
Highly effective. Men who invested more in these distant pilgrimages received more nominations for all the positive reputation qualities, being devout, generous, hardworking, having good character. The big financial cost broadcast this generalized brysociality.
They used the currency they controlled to pay a spectacular price. So what about the women who didn't have that control over money? They had to rely on time and energy.
The women's primary strategy involved daily routine practices, things like fasting, doing local pilgrimages around the village, counting prayer beads, prostrating over and over, high-frequency, high-time and energy cost activities, but with a very low financial cost.
So you have persistent, time-consuming effort on one side versus a spectacular, infrequent financial cost on the other. What was the reputational result for the women?
The disparity was profound. The women's daily, time-intensive practices strongly increased nominations for being devout, which you'd expect. But, and this is genuinely counterintuitive, those same practices were negatively associated with nominations for other crucial pro-social traits.
Like being generous and hardworking.
Exactly. Their dedication actually seemed to harm their reputation in those areas.
How does CST even begin to explain that? That seems completely backward.
The researchers propose that in this patriarchal agricultural community, time is an incredibly valuable resource for the household, for work in the fields. The huge time investment the women were making in their daily rituals was time they weren't spending on other critical labor.
Oh, wow.
So the signal receivers, the men, their peers, likely saw this intense focus on private spiritual well-being as taking away from the benefit of the community or the household. So they penalized them in the reputation domains of being hardworking and generous.
That is just a powerful illustration of the cold logic of this. Even an act that seems altruistic can be interpreted as selfish if it detracts from group productivity in an environment where resources are scarce. The system penalized them for using the only currency they controlled, time, because that time was socially required somewhere else.
It really confirms that for a signal to broadcast this general sense of being a good cooperative person, it often needs to be spectacular and involve a high financial cost, which only the men could afford. The frequent, time-consuming signals that the women were limited to were judged as being too expensive in terms of lost labor.
The adaptability of this theory is just remarkable. Once you get the core mechanism that you demonstrate quality through a differential cost, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere. It goes far beyond money and mating.
Let's talk about art. How is creating a piece of art a costly signal?
Well, artistic virtuosity requires an immense amount of resources. You need the time to learn and master the skills. You need the physical resources for the materials. You need the stability to protect your work while you're creating it.
Right.
So producing high-quality art is hypothesized to be a costly signal of health, of superior cognitive ability, of having good genes, and of course of having access to resources. A low-quality, unhealthy individual, or someone who is cognitively impaired, they couldn't afford to dedicate years to mastering oil painting. They'd just be scrambling to survive day to day.
Precisely. That time investment represents a huge opportunity cost. All the time that wasn't spent foraging or fighting or defending resources. Only the highest quality individuals can afford that kind of sustained dedication. And this signaling function was likely favored through sexual selection, at least initially.
Is there evidence for that?
There is. Some research has found that a greater effort toward creating public art is associated with having higher numbers of sexual partners, both among young adults and professional artists.
So the modern art world, where people pay millions for a complex abstract painting or invest huge sums in digital art like NFTs, that's just a continuation of this same logic. The cost isn't in the paint or the pixels.
It's the cost of the artist's unique time, their skill, their status. That's what guarantees it as a reliable signal of their fitness or their genius. It's the cost of non-replicability. If anyone could do it, the signal would be worthless. The higher the barrier to entry, the more reliable the signal.
Okay, let's move from creating things to fixing things. How does costly signaling theory apply to apologies? Because just saying I'm sorry is maybe the cheapest, easiest to fake signal there is. It's totally unreliable.
And that's exactly why CST suggests that to really restore cooperation after you've messed up, you need a costly apology.
Okay.
The cost you incur has to be big enough to outweigh whatever benefit a cheater would get from tricking you one more time. If the relationship is really valuable, the cost has to be proportionally high to prove your sincerity and your commitment to not messing up again.
So what does that look like? If I crash my neighbor's car, is paying their insurance deductible the costly signal? Or is it something more?
That's a great way to put it. Paying the deductible is just restitution. You're just undoing the damage you caused. That's not really a signal of contrition.
So the costly signal is the extra step.
It's the voluntary imposition of further loss on yourself, like spending your whole weekend washing and detailing their other car for free, or accepting some form of self-punishment, or giving them a large gift that goes way beyond simple reimbursement. Studies that use vignettes show that costly apologies, ones that involve a financial loss or self-sacrifice, significantly increase how sincere the apology is perceived to be.
And researchers have taken this idea to a really dark and extreme place by looking at non-lethal suicide attempts.
Yes. In cases where a really valuable relationship, a marriage, a close family bond, is severely threatened by some transgression, it's been hypothesized that a non-lethal suicide attempt can function as an extremely costly apology.
The cost being the very real chance of death or permanent injury.
An incredibly substantial cost. And a cost that high may be required to signal contrition honestly when the relationship is so fragile and the potential payoff for future cheating is so large that only a life-threatening act can convince the other person that your commitment is real and you won't defect again.
That really drives home the ultimate stakes in this framework. The cost can literally be life and death.
And we see the same principle, believe it or not, applied to signals of need. Signs of illness or depression. These are costs we often incur involuntarily, but they still function as reliable signals to the people who are motivated to help us.
Okay, the bargaining model of depression. How can something as debilitating as major depression be seen as a functional signal?
Well, major depression is characterized by this severe loss of pleasure, this lethargy, this massive reduction in your interest in normal life. It's incredibly costly to the individual suffering from it. This theory proposes that high cost serves as a credible, honest signal of severe need, usually after some major social adversity, a huge personal loss, a labor dispute, something like that. The severity of the symptoms makes the signal prohibitively costly for someone who is not in genuine crisis to successfully fake.
So by being depressed, by pulling back from contributing to the group, the person is kind of leveraging their own suffering to force the group's hand.
That is the bargaining mechanism. The costs of depression dramatically reduce the benefits that person is providing to others. This forces their existing partners, their family, their friends, to reevaluate the relationship. If they value that person for future benefits, they're coerced into upping their social support right now.
To provide aid and comfort to get them back on their feet.
To ensure the person survives and can return to being a full cooperative partner later on. It's a costly negotiation tactic that's enforced by genuine suffering.
So the symptoms are costly, but they're necessary to get the help you need from people who want to help, but also need to avoid being manipulated.
Precisely. And this also applies to conspicuous illness symptoms in general, like intense crying in babies or exaggerated illness displays in adults. These symptoms are energetically costly, they carry reputational risks, but those costs make them reliable signals of genuine need. The theory suggests that if others respond to the signal, say a caregiver provides comfort, the symptoms might actually go down because the need has been acknowledged. Even placebo responses seem to be sensitive to this social feedback.
We have been on a massive tour today. We've connected the dots between the seemingly irrational decision of my broke friend buying expensive scotch, all the way to the cold math that governs the size of a peacock's tail, the economic strategy of a corporate philanthropist, and even the tragic mechanics of psychological distress. What costly signaling theory gives us is this profound and, sometimes cynical shift in perspective.
It really does. It reveals that so many behaviors we tend to dismiss as just irrational or wasteful or purely cultural, our shopping habits, our displays of religious devotion, even our symptoms of suffering, they aren't just random acts of vanity.
They're strategies.
They are deeply rooted, evolutionarily stable strategies. They're designed to broadcast specific, verified information about ourselves to potential mates, to rivals, and maybe most importantly, to our cooperative partners.
And the logic is simple, but it's ruthless. It underpins all of social exchange. If you want other people to reliably believe you have some unobservable quality, whether it's wealth or skill or commitment, you have to pay a price that makes the signal too expensive for a faker to afford.
That empty fridge and that luxury bottle, they are not a contradiction. They are the result of a single cold calculation that is designed to maximize social or reproductive gain by paying a very high but very necessary price.